Our next speaker is Hind Alansari from Qatar. And Hind is currently a PhD candidate at Cambridge University in the UK. Her research interests revolves around the impact of education reform on conservative governments and societies. And before her PhD, Hind earned her MA degree in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. Outside of academia, Hind is an aspiring filmmaker, and she's already directed and produced a short film back in 2014, which was showcased at a number of film festivals, including and very impressively at the Cannes Film Festival. And Hind will talk to us about changes in the educational opportunities and access to education for women in Qatar over time. Please welcome Hind to the stage.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Before I begin, I also want to thank the organizers of this event for a lovely evening. Really, it's been amazing so far, top to now, and thank you everyone, of course, for showing up. It really is a pleasure. So over the past 2 decades, the GCC states have taken major strides to transform their economies from being dependent on gas and oil revenues that they send to international clients, more to knowledge-based economies in which there is high human capital competence. And to say it differently, the overarching goal is to maximize the national participation in the economy and to lessen the dependency on foreign expertise and labor. In Qatar alone, which is one of the smaller GCC states, most of the state's revenues are acquired from natural gas exports to international clients, which has enabled the state to take initiative and begin to materialize change in a number of fields, including the field of education. So for example, the state has heavily invested in Education City, which some of you might know is a multi-billion-dollar education hub. It hosts a number of American and European universities. And by the way, this was not only open to educate local students, but also international students from around the world. Education reform is part of a larger vision known as Qatar Vision 2030. This vision was disclosed in 2008, and its main objective, in quotes, is to transform Qatar into an advanced society capable of achieving sustainable development. The goals of this vision are divided into 4 main pillars, which are economic, social, environmental, and human development. So noticeably, women are mentioned a number of times in this report. For example, under social development, it reads, enhance women's capacities and empower them to participate fully in the political and economic spheres, especially in the decision-making process. So the language here implies that women don't necessarily have equal access to various opportunities in men. And indeed, for the longest time, there were sociocultural factors that have hindered their progress and hindered their access to various opportunities. However, despite the challenges, women have proven otherwise. They particularly exceed in education where they outperform men. So, for example, in the National University, women represent more than the half of the student body at the National University. They also are more likely to complete their high school degrees and their bachelor degrees than men. And there is also a rising interest among women to pursue their master and doctorate degrees. So the government does view women as an asset to the country's future. But what we're seeing now is a culmination of a century-long process. In the early 1900s, before the discovery of oil, education in Qatar mostly revolved around the Kutab teaching system, which is more of a Quranic schooling. And while boys were learning how to read and how to write basically, or basic writing, girls were only taught how to read. And this was because there was a common fear in the society that if we teach women how to read and write, they'll be in contact with the outside world and therefore develop beliefs that would clash with the Qatari system. Things began to change after the discovery of oil, however, in 1939, when Al-Jeda, who was the first Qatari female teacher back then and a celebrated figure in Qatar today, began a campaign to advocate for females' participation in formal education. And although her attempts were met with backlash and setbacks and etc., eventually her efforts were actually paid off, and the first formal school for girls was established in 1955. And around the same time, there was a religious leader named Muhammad al-Mana. He released a decree stating unequivocally that girls' education was actually in line with Islamic teachings. Beginning in the 1960s, women were granted access to post-secondary education, although there was no university back then in Qatar. While there were initially some cultural backlash or objections from conservative members of the society, in 1968, the Qatari government offered scholarship programs to support women's participation in higher education abroad. And to assuage family concerns, what they did is that they offered financial support for family members who wanted to accompany their daughters abroad. And also, they opened dormitories in cities with a high student concentration, such as Cairo. And these approaches alleviated some of the concerns that family had, and in return boosted the number of females who were able to travel for their education. Now, their participation in education even dramatically expanded in 1973 with the founding of Qatar University. At first, women studied at most of the colleges except for the College of Engineering because it was not considered appropriate for their gender. And as for the workforce, women occupied jobs in public sectors and in segregated environments, such as ministries and schools. Other women, however, they graduated high school and they got married and settled, and which made them depend on their husbands to provide for them. Today, however, the number of women participating in the workforce have substantially grown. Women have proven that they are capable of assuming careers in various fields, especially in leadership positions. To share with you a few examples, the spokesperson to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a female, the permanent representative at the UN is also a female, and the co-founder of Education City is the mother of the current emir, Sheikha Moza al-Musnad. Sheikha Moza has revolutionized the field of education in Qatar, especially for women. She is a driving force behind Education City, which, as I mentioned before, has a number of American and European universities. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, she traveled with her team to the US to negotiate agreements with a number of universities for the establishment of branch campuses. Some argue that this project was actually initiated and heavily invested in because of hardworking women in Qatar who are unable to travel for their education, and for them to be given the opportunity to acquire world-class international education while at home around their families. Furthermore, Sheikha Moza's public appearances and activism, both locally and internationally, has really encouraged many women to challenge some of the cultural perceptions about them. For example, the involvement of Qatari women in the STEM field has begun to erode some of the cultural beliefs about women's participation in traditionally male-dominated careers. More specifically, we now have a soaring number of female engineers competing alongside men in prominent international companies such as Total, Shell, Exxon, you name it, etc. And keep in mind, this is a field that they once prohibited from studying and working in. Now, even though there has been significant expansions in the role of women, some traditional ideas about gender have persisted. For example, women still require the permission of their guardian to travel until the age of 25. In some public sector jobs, women are required to provide their guardian's consent. So if the father is absent, the brother, if the brother is absent, there is the uncle. Written consent to prove that the guardian does not object to them working. The reform efforts have taken place still have not gained universal acceptance. Some families claim that the state's effort to modernize the country are troubling, in a sense that they contradict the Qatari value system. And Education City is a prime example of this because they argue that it exposes their daughters to foreign influences beyond their control. As for women who are able to partake in these opportunities granted by the government, their path is not without obstacles. They usually grapple with the challenge of balancing their own educational and career aspirations with family expectations. So, for example, many women consider marriage as an obstacle or a hindrance to their long-term plans, and therefore they prefer to delay it to a later time. But some families find that delaying marriage makes a woman undesirable to potential suitors. Also, while many of the highest impact jobs are in mixed gender workplaces, in some cases, some Qatari men pressure their wives to pursue careers in gender segregated environments. Of course, complex cultural change does not happen overnight. One encouraging sign is the vibrant public discussion about these issues that is taking place on social media platforms. We are witnessing a new generation of highly educated women who have benefited from these reforms, demanding further rights and further improvements in their rights on a formal and informal level. On Twitter, for example, Qatari women have spoken out to demand their rights, improvement in their rights, and to criticize some of the gender norms that they feel are unjust in their way and their progress. So this perhaps is where effective change really begins. Thank you.